Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 20, The United States and the Middle Class Crisis. Continued. But there is widespread tolerance and endless discussion of all these issues. This discussion, like most of the adolescent endless talk, never reaches any decisions but leaves the question open, or decides that it all depends on how you look at it. As part of such discussions, there is complete casual frankness as to who has had or is having sexual experiences with whom. Widely permeated with an existentialist outlook, the adolescent society regards each sexual experience as an isolated, contextless act with no necessary cause or consequence, except the momentary merging of two lonelinesses in an act of togetherness. Among middle-class youth, it is accompanied by an atmosphere of compassion or pity, rather than of passion or even love, the way Holden Caulfield might experience sex. Among lower-class persons, it is much more likely to be physiologically inspired and associated with passion or roughness. This often attracts middle-class girls who become dissatisfied with the weakness and undersexuality of middle-class boys. But petty bourgeois youth, as befits the final defenders of middle-class conventionality and hypocrisy, still tend to approach sex with secrecy and even guilt. Because of the breakdown of communication between the generations of middle-class families, parents know little of this side of teenage culture, at least so far as their own children are concerned. They usually know much more about the behavior of their friends' children, because they are more likely to catch glimpses of the behavior of the latter in unguarded moments. On the whole, middle-class parents today are surprisingly and secretly tolerant about the behavior of their daughters, so long as they do not create a public scandal by getting into trouble. Mothers usually feel that their sons are too young and should wait for sexual experience, while fathers sometimes secretly think it might do their sons' immaturity some good. When middle-class children get into trouble, or any kind of a scrap, their only large anxiety is to prevent their parents from finding out. Petty bourgeois parents, as the last defense of middle-class conventionality, generally disapprove of any illicit sexual experiences by any of their children. Naturally, there are great variations in all these things, with religion as the chief varying factor and variety of local customs in secondary significance. However, even in religious circles, the behavior of the young is not at all what their adults expect or believe. For example, the number of Roman Catholic young people who have premarital or even casual sexual experiences is much larger than the number who are willing to eat meat on Friday. One reason for the spreading of these relaxed ideas on behavior is the devastating honesty of the younger generation, especially about themselves. This seems to be based on their gregarious garrulity. An earlier generation had its share of illicit actions of various kinds, but they kept these a secret and regarded each as an aberrant action that was psychologically excluded from their accepted social patterns and would not, therefore, be repeated. This view continued, no matter how often it was repeated. But the younger generation of today has accepted the existentialist idea, I am what I do. The adolescent tells his group what he did, and they usually agree that this is the way he is, however surprising it is. Their whole attitude is pragmatic, almost experimental. This is what happened. This is the way things are. This is the way I am. They are engaged in a search for themselves as individuals, something they were called upon to do in the early grades of school, thanks to the misconceptions of John Dewey, and they are quite alien to any theory that the self is a creature of trained patterns and is not a creature of discovered secrets. Now, in the 1960s, this opinion of man's nature is changing, and as a consequence of George Orwell, mishmash conceptions of brainwashing and the revival of Pavlovian psychology through the work of men like Professor B.F. Skinner of Harvard, the idea of personality as something trained under discipline to be a desired pattern is being revived. With this revival of a basically puritanical idea of human nature reappears the usual Puritan errors on the nature of evil and acceptance of the theory of the evil of human nature, as preached in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. The new outlook emerging from all this is complex, tentative, and full of inconsistencies, but it will surely play an increasing role in our history as the younger generation grows older, abandoning many of the ideas they now hold with increasing responsibility. But at the same time, the new outlook will force very great modifications in the American point of view as a whole. This new outlook of the rising generation of the middle class has a negative and positive effect. Its negative side can be seen in its large-scale unconcern for the basic values of the middle-class outlook, its rejection of self-discipline, of future preference, of infinitely expandable material living standards, and of material symbols of middle-class status. In general, this negative attitude appears in many of the activities we have described, and above all is a profound rejection of abstractions, slogans, clichés, and conventions. These are treated with tolerant irony, tinged with contempt. The targets of these attributes are the general values of the petty bourgeois and of middle-class parents, position in society, what people think, self-respect, keeping up with the Joneses, the American way of life, virtue, making money, destroying our country's enemies, virginity, respect for established organizations, including their elders, the clergy, political leaders, or big businessmen, and such. The shift from a destructive or negative to a positive view of the new American outlook is, to some extent, chronological. It may be seen in the former popularity of Elvis Presley and the newer enthusiasm for Joan Baez, or folk singers generally. There is also a social distinction here to some extent, as Elvis remains, to a fair degree, popular with the lower classes, while Joan is a middle-class or even college-level favorite. But the contrast in outlook between the two is what is significant. Joan is gentle, compassionate, unemphatic, totally honest, concerned about people as individuals, free of pretenses, singing quietly in a simple dress and bare feet, full of love and fundamental human decency, and committed to these. The rejection of acquisitiveness, and even of sensuality, may be seen in the change in tastes in movies, especially in the popularity of foreign films directed by men like Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini. The latter's La Dolce Vita, 1961, a smash hit in the United States, was a portrayal of the meaningless disillusionment of material success and of sensuality in contrast with the power and mystery of nature, symbolized by a giant fish pulled from the sea and left to die by thoughtless men and the direct honesty and innocence of a child watching the scene. This rejection of material things and of sensuality is, in some strange way, leading the younger generation to some kind of increased spirituality. Property and food mean very little to them. They share almost everything, give to others when they have very little for themselves, expect reciprocal sharing, but not repayment, and feel free to borrow in this way without permission. 3 meals a day is out. In fact, meals are almost out. They eat very little and irregularly, in sharp contrast to the middle classes early in the century who overate, as many mature middle-class persons still do. The petty bourgeois and lower classes still tend to overeat, or to be neurotic snackers. But middle-class youth is almost monastic in its eating. Food just is not important, unless it is an occasion for a crowd to gather. Much of this decrease in emphasis on food is a consequence of their rejection of the discipline of time. Everything in their lives is irregular, including their natural bodily processes. They usually get up too late to eat breakfast, snack somewhere along the day, refuse to carry watches, and often have no idea what day of the week it is. This new outlook is basically existentialist in its emphasis on direct momentary personal experience, especially with other people. It emphasizes people and finds the highest good of life in interpersonal relations, handled generally with compassion and irony. The two chief concerns of life are caring and helping. Caring, which they usually call love, means a general acceptance of the fact that people matter and are subjects of concern. This love is diffuse and often quite impersonal, not aimed at a particular individual or friend, but at anyone, at persons in general, and especially at persons one does not know at all, as an act of recognition, almost of expiation, that we are all helpless children together. The whole idea is very close to Christ's message, love one another, and has given rise to the younger generation's passionate concern with remote peoples, the American Negroes, and the outcast poor. It is reflected in the tremendous enthusiasm among the young for the Peace Corps, civil rights, and racial equality, and the attack on poverty, all of which have much greater support among middle-class young people than can be measured even by the surprisingly large numbers who actively do something. This desire to do something is what I call helping. It is a strange and largely symbolic kind of helping, since there is with it a fairly widespread feeling that nothing that the helper can do will make any notable dent in the colossal problem. Nonetheless, there is an obligation to do something, not only as a symbolic act, but also as an almost masochistic rejection of the middle-class past. The younger generation who support the Peace Corps, the attack on poverty, and the drive for Negro rights have an almost irresistible compulsion to do these things as a demonstration for their rejection of their parents' value system, and as some restitution for the adults' neglect of these urgent problems. But the real motivation behind the urge to help is closely related with the urge to care. It consists simply of a desire to show another human being that he is not alone. There is little concern for human perfectibility or social progress, such as accompanied middle-class humanitarianism in the 19th century. Both of these urges are existentialists. They give rise to isolated acts that have no significant context. Thus, an act of loving or helping has no sequence of causes leading up to it, or of consequences flowing from it. It stands alone as an isolated experience of togetherness and of brief human sharing. This failure or lack of context for each experience means a failure or lack of meaning. For meaning and significance arise from context, that is, from the relationship of the particular experience to the whole picture. But today's youth has no concern for the whole picture. They reject the past and have very little faith in the future. Their rejection of intellect and their lack of faith in human reason gives them no hope that any meaning can be found for any experience. So each experience becomes an end in itself, isolated from every other experience. This skepticism about meaning, closely allied with their rejection of organizations and of abstractions, is also closely related with a failure of responsibility. Since consequences are divorced from the act of experience itself, the youth is not bound by any relationship between the two. The result is a large-scale irresponsibility. If a young person makes an appointment, he may or may not keep it. He may come very late or not at all. In any case, he feels no shame at failure to carry out what he said he would do. In fact, the young people of today constantly speak of what they are going to do after lunch, tonight, tomorrow, next week, but they rarely do what they say. To them, it was always very tentative, a hope rather than a statement, and binding on no one. If the young fail to do what they say, they are neither embarrassed nor apologetic, and hardly think it necessary to explain or even mention it. Their basic position is that everyone concerned had the same freedom to come or not, and if you showed up while they did not, this does not give you any right to complain, because you also had the same right to stay away as they had. The other great weakness of the younger generation is their lack of self-discipline. They are as episodic in their interests and ambitions as they are in their actions. They can almost kill themselves with overwork for something that catches their fancy, usually something associated with their group or with caring and helping. But in general, they have little tenacity of application or self-discipline in action. They lack imagination also, an almost inevitable consequence of an outlook that concentrates on experiences without context. Their experiences are necessarily limited and personal, and are never fitted into a larger picture or linked with the past or the future. As a result, they find it almost impossible to picture anything different from what it is, or even to see what it is from any long-range perspective. This means that their outlooks, in spite of their wide exposure to different situations through the mass media or by personal travel, are very narrow. They lack the desire to obtain experience vicariously from reading, and the vicarious experiences that they get from talk, usually with their fellows, are rarely much different from their own experiences. As a result, their lives, while erratic, are strangely dull and homogeneous. Even their sexual experiences are routine, and any efforts to escape this by experimenting with homosexuality, alcohol, drugs, extra-racial partners, or other unnecessary fringe accessories generally leave it dull and routine. Efforts by middle-class parents to prevent their children from developing along these non-middle-class lines are generally futile. An effort to use parental discipline to enforce conformity to middle-class values or behavior means that the child will quote all the many cases in the neighborhood where the children are not being disciplined. He is encouraged in his resistance to parental discipline by its large-scale failure all around him. Moreover, if his parents insist on conformity, he has an invincible weapon to use against them: academic failure. This weapon is used by boys rather than by girls, partly because it is a weapon for the weak, and involves doing nothing rather than doing something, but also because the school seems to most middle-class boys an alien place, and an essential element in their general adolescent feeling of homelessness. Girls who are pressured by their parents to conform resist by sexual delinquencies, more often than boys, and in extreme cases get pregnant or have sexual experiences with Negro boys. From this whole context of adolescent resistance to parental pressures to conform to middle-class behavior flows a major portion of middle-class adolescent delinquency, which is quite distinct in its origin from the delinquency of the lowest, outcast class in the slums. It involves all kinds of activities, from earliest efforts to smoke or drink, through speeding, car stealing, and vandalism of property, to major crimes and perversions. It is quite different in origin and usually in character from the delinquencies of the uprooted, which are either crimes for personal benefits, such as thievery and mugging, or crimes of social resentment, such as slashing tires and convertible tops, or smashing school windows. Some activities, of course, such as automobile stealing, appear among both. These remarks, it must be emphasized, apply to the middle class and are not intended to apply to the other classes in American society. The aristocrats, for example, have considerable success in passing along their outlook to their children, partly because it is presented as a class or family attitude, and not as a parental or personal attitude, partly because their friends and close associates are also aristocrats or semi-aristocrats, and rejection of their point of view tends to leave an aristocratic adolescent much more personally isolated than rejection of his parents' view leaves a middle-class adolescent. Indeed, the latter finds group togetherness only if he does reject his parents, partly because there is much more segregation of the sexes among aristocrats than in the middle class, but chiefly because the aristocrats use a separate school system, including disciplined boarding schools. The use of the latter, the key to the long persistence of the aristocratic tradition in England, makes it possible for outsiders to discipline adolescents without disrupting the family. Among the middle class, effort to discipline adolescents is largely in the hands of parents, but the effort to do so tends to disrupt the family by setting husband against wife and children against parents. As a result, discipline is usually held back to retain at least the semblance of family solidarity as viewed from the outside world, which is what really counts with middle-class people. But the aristocratic private boarding school, modeled on those of England, in accord with the basic Anglophilism of the American aristocracy, is sexually segregated from females, tough, sports-oriented, usually high Episcopal, almost Anglican, and disciplines its charges with the importance of the group, their duty to the group, and the painfulness of the ultimate punishment, which is alienation from the group. As a consequence of this, any resentment the aristocratic adolescent may have is aimed at his masters, not at his home and parents. And home comes to represent a relatively desirable place to which he is admitted occasionally as a reward for long weeks on the firing line at school. Such a boy is removed from the smothering influence of momism, grows up relatively shy of girls, has more than his share of homosexual experiences, to which he may succumb completely, but on the whole usually grows up to be a very energetic, constructive, stable, and self-sacrificing citizen, prepared to inflict the same training process on his own sons. Unfortunately for the aristocrat who wishes to expose his son to the same training process as that which molded his own outlook, he finds this a difficult thing to do, because the organizations that helped form him outside the family, the Episcopal Church, or its local equivalent, the boarding school, the Ivy League University, and the once sheltered summer resort, have all changed and are being invaded by a large number of non-aristocratic intruders who change the atmosphere of the whole place. This change in atmosphere is hard to define to anyone who has not experienced it personally. Fundamentally, it is a distinction between playing the game and playing to win. The aristocrat plays for the sake of the game, or the team, or the school. He plays whether he is much good or not, because he feels that he is contributing to a community effort, even if he is on the scrubs rather than a star or starting player. The newer recruits to former aristocratic educational institutions play for more personal reasons, with much greater intensity, even fanaticism, and play to excel and to distinguish themselves from others. One reason for the accessibility of formerly aristocratic organizations to people of non-aristocratic origin has already been noted. but probably was discounted by the reader. That is my statement that the American establishment, which is so aristocratic and Anglophile in its foundation, came to accept the liberal ideology. The Episcopal Church, exclusive boarding schools, and Ivy League universities like Eton and Oxford decided that they must open their doors to the more able and the non-aristocratic classes. Accordingly, they established scholarships, recruited for these in lower schools they had never thought of before, and made efforts to have their admission requirements and examinations fit the past experiences of non-aristocratic applicants. By the end of the 1920s, Philip Exeter Academy was welcoming on scholarships the sons of laboring immigrants with polysyllabic names, and by the 1950s, Episcopal clergymen were making calls on likely-looking Negro families. As a consequence of this, the sons of aristocrats found themselves being squeezed out of the formative institutions that had previously trained their fathers, and, at the same time, discovered that these institutions were themselves changing their character and becoming dominated by petty bourgeois rather than by aristocratic values. At the alumni reunions of June 1964, the president of Harvard was asked in an open forum what the questioner should do with his son, recently rejected for admission to Harvard in spite of the fact that the son was descended from the Mayflower voyagers by 11 consecutive generations of Harvard men. To this tragic question, President Pusey replied, "I don't know what we can do about your son. We can't send him back because the Mayflower isn't running anymore." Despite this fastidious retort, which may have been called forth by the inebriate condition of the questioner, the fact remains that the aristocratic outlook has a great deal to contribute to any organization fortunate enough to share it. Among other things, it has kept Harvard, where aristocratic control continued almost to the present day, at the top or close to the top of the American educational hierarchy, decade after decade. The sincere effort by aristocrats and Democrats alike to make the social ladder in America a ladder of opportunity rather than a ladder of privilege has opened the way to a surge of petty bourgeois recruits over the faltering bodies of the disintegrating middle class. The petty bourgeois are rising in American society along the channels established in the great American hierarchies of business, the armed forces, academic life, the professions, finance, and politics. They are doing this not because they have imagination, broad vision, judgment, moderation, versatility, or group loyalties, but because they have neurotic drives of personal ambition and competitiveness. Great insecurities and resentments, narrow specialization, and fanatical application to the task before each of them. Their fathers earning $100 a week as bank clerks or insurance agents, while unionized bricklayers were getting $120 a week when they cared to work, embraced the middle-class ideology with tenacity as the chief means, along with their white-collared clothing, of distinguishing themselves from the unionized labor they feared or hated. Their wives, whom they had married because they held the same outlook, looked forward eagerly to seeing their sons become the kind of material success the father had failed to reach. The family accepted a common outlook that believed specialization and hard work, either in business or in a profession, would win their material success. The steps up that ladder of success were clearly marked: to be the outstanding boy student and graduate in school, to win entrance to and graduation from the best university possible, naturally an Ivy League one, and then the final years of specialized application in a professional school. Many of these eager workers headed for medicine, because to them medicine, despite the 10 years of necessary preparation, meant up to $40,000 a year income by age 50. As a consequence, the medical profession in the United States ceased, very largely, to be a profession of fatherly confessors and unprofessing humanitarians, and became one of the largest groups of hard-headed petty bourgeois hustlers in the United States, and their professional association became the most ruthlessly materialistic lobbying association of any professional group. Similar persons with lesser opportunities were shunted off the more advantageous rungs of the ladder into second-best schools and third-rate universities. All flocked into the professions, even to teaching, which, on the face of it, might have expected that its practitioners would have some allegiance to the truth and to helping the young to realize their less materialistic potentialities, where they quickly abandoned the classroom for the more remunerative tasks of educational administration. And, of course, the great mass of these eager beavers went into science or business, preferably into the largest corporations, where they looked with fishy-eyed anticipation at those rich, if remote, plumes of vice presidencies in General Motors, Ford, General Dynamics, or international business machines. The success of these petty bourgeois recruits in America's organizational structure rested on their ability to adapt their lives to the screening processes the middle classes had set up covering access to the middle-class organizational structures. The petty bourgeoisie, as the last fanatical defenders of the middle-class outlook, had, in excess degree, the qualities of self-discipline and future preference the middle classes had established as the unstated assumptions behind their screens of aptitude testing, intelligence evaluation, motivational research, and potential success measurements. Above all, the American public school system, permeated with the unstated assumptions of middle-class values, was ideally situated to demonstrate petty bourgeois success quotients. These successive barriers in the middle-class screening process were almost insurmountable to the working class and the outcast, became very difficult to the new generation of middle-class children who rejected their parents' value system, but were ideally adapted to the petty bourgeois anxiety neuroses. By 1960, however, big business, government civil service, and the Ivy League universities were becoming disillusioned with these petty bourgeois recruits. The difficulty was that these new recruits were rigid, unimaginative, narrow, and, above all, illiberal at a time when liberalism, in the sense of reaching tentative and approximate decisions through flexible community interaction, was coming to be regarded as the proper approach to large organization problems. In his farewell report, the chairman of Harvard's admissions committee, Wilbur Bender, summed up the problem this way. The student who ranks first in his class may be genuinely brilliant, or he may be a compulsive worker, or the instrument of domineering parents' ambitions, or a conformist, or a self-centered careerist, who has shrewdly calculated his teacher's prejudices and expectations and discovered how to regurgitate efficiently what they want. Or he may have focused narrowly on grade-getting as compensation for his inadequacies in other areas, because he lacks other interests or talents, or lacks passion and warmth or normal healthy instincts, or is afraid of life. The top high school student is often, frankly, a pretty dull and bloodless or peculiar fellow. The adolescent with wide-ranging curiosity and stubborn independence, with a vivid imagination and desire to explore fascinating bypaths, to follow his own interests, to contemplate, to read the unrequired books. The boy filled with sheer love of life and exuberance may well seem to his teachers troublesome, undisciplined, a rebel, may not conform to their stereotype, and may not get the top grades and the highest rank in class. He may not even score the highest level in the standard multiple-choice admissions tests, which may well reward the glib, facile mind at the expense of the questioning, independent, or slower but more powerful, more subtle, and more interesting and original mind. These remarks bring us close to one of the major problems in American culture today. We need a culture that will produce people eager to do things, but we need even more, a culture that will make it possible to decide what to do. This is the old division of means and goals. Decisions about goals require values, meaning, context, perspective. They can be set, even tentatively and approximately, only by people who have some inkling of the whole picture. The middle-class culture of our past ignored the whole picture and destroyed our ability to see it by its emphasis on specialization. Just as mass production came to be based on specialization, so human preparation for making decisions about goals also became based on specialization. The free elective system in higher education was associated with choice of a major field of specialization, and all the talk about liberal arts, outside electives, general education, or required distribution were largely futile. They were futile because no general view of the whole picture could be made simply by attaching together a number of specialist views of narrow fields, for the simple reason that each specialist field looks entirely different, presenting different problems and requiring different techniques when it is placed in the general picture. This simple fact still has not been realized in those circles that talk most about broadening outlooks. This was clearly shown in the influential Harvard Report on General Education, 1945. As one reviewer of this document said, "It cost $40,000 to produce, and a better answer could have been found by buying one of the books of Sir Richard Livingstone for $2.75. This remark is equally mistaken on the opposite side, a fact that shows that the solution can be found only by all parties freeing themselves from their preconceptions by getting as familiar as possible with the diverse special areas in a skeptical way. Means are almost as difficult as ends. In fact, personal responsibility, self-discipline, some sense of time value and future preference, and above all, an ability to distinguish what is important from what is merely necessary, must be found, simply as valuable attributes of human beings as human beings. Neither America nor the world can be saved by a wholesale recreation of African social realities here in consequence of our rejection of the middle-class outlook that brought us this far. Here we must discriminate. We have an achieving society because we have an achieving outlook in our society. And that achieving outlook has been, over the last few centuries, the middle-class outlook. But there are other achieving outlooks. An achieving society could be constructed on the aristocratic outlook, on the scientific outlook, pursuit of truth, on a religious basis, and probably on a large number of other outlooks. There is no need to go back to the middle-class outlook, which really killed itself by successfully achieving what it set out to do. But parts of it we need, and above all, we need an achieving outlook. It might be pleasant just to give up, live in the present, enjoying existential personal experiences, living like lotus eaters from our amazing productive system, without personal responsibility, self-discipline, or thought of the future. But this is impossible, because the productive system would itself collapse, and our external enemies would soon destroy us. We must have an achieving society and an achieving outlook. These will inevitably contain parts of the middle-class outlook, but these parts will unquestionably be fitted together to serve quite different purposes. Future preference and self-discipline were originally necessary in our society, so that people would restrict consumption and accumulate savings that could be spent to provide investment in capital equipment. Now we no longer need these qualities for this purpose, since flows of income in our economy provide these on an institutional basis. But we still need these qualities so that young people will be willing to undergo the years of hard work and training that will prepare them to work in our complex technological society. We must get away from the older crass materialism and egocentric selfish individualism and pick up some of the younger generation's concern for the community and their fellow men. The unconventionality of this younger group may make them more able to provide the new outlook and innovation every society requires, but they cannot do this if they lack imagination or perspective. Above all, we must bring meaning back into human experience. This, like establishing and achieving outlook, can be done by going backward in our Western tradition to the period before we had any bourgeois outlook. For our society had both meaning and purpose long before it had any middle class. Indeed, these are intrinsic elements in our society. In fact, the middle class outlook obtained its meaning and purpose from the society where it grew up. It did not give meaning and purpose to the society. And capitalism, along with the middle class outlook, became meaningless and purposeless when it so absorbed men's time and energies that men lost touch with the meaning and purpose of the society in which capitalism was a brief and partial aspect. But as a consequence of the influence of capitalism and of the middle classes, the tradition was broken, and the link between the meaning and purpose of our society as it was before the middle class revolution is no longer connected with the search for meaning and purpose by the new post-middle class generation. This can be seen even in those groups like the Christian clergy, who insisted that they were still clinging to the basic Christian tradition of our society. They were doing no such thing, but instead were usually offering us meaningless verbiage or unrealistic abstractions that had little to do with our desire to experience and live in a Christian way, here and now. Unfortunately, very few people, even highly regarded experts on the subject, have any very clear idea of what is the tradition of the West, or how it is based on the fundamental need of Western civilization to reconcile its intellectual outlook with the basic facts of the Christian experience. The reality of the world, time, and the flesh forced, bit by bit, abandonment of the Greek rationalistic dualism, as in Plato, that opposed spirit and matter, and made knowledge exclusively a concern of the former, achieved by internal illumination. This point of view that gave final absolute knowledge, and thus justified despotism, was replaced in the period 1100 to 1350 by the medieval point of view that derived knowledge from the tentative and partial information obtained through sensual experience, from which man derived conceptual universals that fitted the real individual cases encountered in human experience, only approximately. Aquinas, who said, "Nothing exists in the intelligence which was not first present in the senses," also said, "We cannot shift from the ideal to the actual." On this epistemological basis, we establish the root foundations of both modern science and modern liberalism, with a very considerable boost to both from the Franciscan nominalists of the century following Aquinas. The classical world had constantly fallen into intellectual error because it never solved the epistemological problem of the relationship between the theories and concepts in men's minds and the individual objects of sensual experience. The medieval period made a detailed examination of this problem, but its answer was ignored when post-Renaissance thinkers broke the tradition in philosophy because they felt it necessary to break the tradition in religion. From Descartes onward, this epistemological problem was ignored or considered in a childish way, as if the medieval thinkers had never examined it. Today it remains as the great philosophic problem of our age. Irrational activism, semanticism, and existentialism flourish because the present century has no answer to the epistemological problem. In fact, most contemporary thinkers do not even recognize that there is a problem. But Bergson's rejection of intelligence and his advocacy of intuition was based, like the irrational activism whence it sprang, on recognition of the fact that the space-time continuum in which man generally operates is non-rational. The whole existential movement was based on the same idea. Semanticism tried to solve the problem in a similar fashion by bringing the infinitely varied and dynamic quality of actuality into the human mind, by insisting that the meaning of each word must follow the dynamics of the world by changing every time it is used. All these movements try to reject logic and rationality from the human thinking process because they are not found in space-time actuality. But the tradition of the West, as clearly established in the Christian religion and in medieval philosophy, was that man must use rationality to the degree it is possible in handling a universe whose ultimate nature is well beyond man's present rational capability to grasp. This is the conclusion that the success of the West in World War II forces the West and the world to recognize once again. And in recognizing it, we must return to the tradition, so carelessly discarded in the 15th century, which had shown the relationship between thought and action. Alfred Korzybski argued in Science and Sanity that mental health depended on successful action, and that successful action depended on an adequate relationship between the irrational nature of the objective world and the vision of the world that the actor has subjectively in his head. Korzybski's solution, like most other thinkers over the last 2 generations, has been to bring the irrationality of the world into man's thinking processes. This solution of the problem is now bankrupt, totally destroyed at Hiroshima and Berlin in 1945. The alternative solution lies in the tradition of the West. It must be found, and the link with our past must be restored, so that the tradition may resume the process of growth that was interrupted so long ago. Korzybski, Bergson, and the rest of them are quite correct. Most of man's experience takes place in an irrational actuality of space-time. But we know now that man must deal with his experience through subjective processes that are both rational and logical. Using rules of thought explicitly understood by all concerned, and the necessary adjustments between the conclusions reached by thought and the confused irrationalities of experience must be made in the process of shifting from thought to action, and not in the thinking process itself. Only thus will the West achieve successful thought, successful action, and the sanity that is the link between these two. As a result of this rupture of tradition, the thinkers of today are fumbling in an effort to find a meaning that will satisfy them. This is as true of the contemporary babbling philosophers as it is of the younger generation who fumblingly try to express Christ's message of love and help without any apparent realization that Christ's message is available in writing, and that generations of thinkers debated its implications centuries ago. The meaning the present generation is seeking can be found in our own past. Part of it, concerned with loving and helping, can be found in Christ by going back to the age before his message was overwhelmed in ritualism and bureaucracy. Part of it can be found in the basic philosophic outlook of the West as seen in medieval philosophy and the scientific method that grew out of it. The problem of meaning today is the problem of how the diverse and superficially self-contradictory experiences of men can be put into a consistent picture that will provide contemporary man with a convincing basis from which to live and to act. This can be achieved only by a hierarchy that distinguishes what is necessary from what is important, as the medieval outlook did. But any modern explanation based on hierarchy must accept dynamicism as an all-pervasive element in the system, as the medieval hierarchy so signally failed to do. The effort of Teilhard de Chardin to do this has won enormous interest in recent years, but its impact has been much blunted by the fact that his presentation contained, in reciprocal relationship, a deficiency of courage and a surplus of deliberate ambiguity. However, the real problem does not rest so much in theory as in practice. The real value of any society rests in its ability to develop mature and responsible individuals, prepared to stand on their own feet, make decisions, and be prepared to accept the consequences of their decisions and actions without whining or self-justification. This was the ideal that the Christian tradition established long ago, and, in consequence of its existence, our Western society, whatever its deficiencies, has done better than any other society that has ever existed. If it has done less well recently than earlier in its career, a disputable point of view, this weakness can be remedied only by some reform in its methods of child rearing that will increase its supply of mature and responsible adults. Once this process had been established, the adults thus produced can be relied upon to adopt from our Western heritage of the past a modified ideology that will fit the needs of the present as well as the traditions of the past. And if Western culture can do that, either in America or in Europe, it need fear no enemies from within or from without.